Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Molina Asthana, and I'm the National President of the Asian Australian Lawyers Association. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all meeting. And for me, it is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and to any other elders who may be joining us today. The topic for this panel is cultural diversity in the political system and law. Similar to legal profession, cultural diversity in politics is an issue. The federal parliament after the recent election for the first time is the most diverse in Australia's history, but it is still not reflective of the population it represents. As with every other profession in Australia, we measure diversity by the proportion of female representation, but that ignores the other strands of diversity, particularly cultural. While the proportion of women representatives now make up 38% of the House of Representatives and 57% of the Senate, which is a record for both chambers, just 6.6%, which is 15 out of 227 MPs, have overseas non-European backgrounds, and only 4.4% of the MPs in the Parliament have Asian heritage, compared with 18% of the Australian population at large. We still have a long way to go before our Parliament truly reflects our changing demographic. Australia still continues to lag far behind similar countries like Canada and New Zealand. Even the United Kingdom is way ahead of us despite being much less culturally diverse. Whether it is racism, party politics, lack of understanding of the political system, or an inertia to participate, there are a number of external and internal barriers that prevent adequate representation of people of culturally diverse backgrounds in the parliament. With 51% of our population born overseas or their parents born overseas, it is unacceptable that our politicians remain mainly Anglo. We have with us three women. The third one is yet to join, because she's having tech issues. Three women of Asian Australian heritage who served as parliamentarians and are trailblazers in their own right. We want to hear about their journeys, their experiences, barriers that people of diverse background face in politics, and solutions to ensure that in the future we see more cultural diversity in the political arena. Before we begin our panel discussion, I want to introduce the panelists briefly. The detailed bios are in the summit booklet and are available on the platform as well. So we have with us Dr. Mehreen Faruqi, Deputy Leader of the Australian Greens, Cassandra Fernando MP, freshly minted federal member for Holt, who we're still waiting on, and Elizabeth Lee, MLA, Leader of the Opposition in the ACT and member of the Kurrajong, for Kurrajong, a long-standing friend of AALA. Welcome to all three of you. I wish our parliament looked a lot more like what this panel looks like. So the first question I would like to ask you is about your personal journeys and what led you to a career in politics.
Mehreen?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to start. Hi, Molina. Hi, Elizabeth. Hello, everyone. I do also want to acknowledge the sovereign owners of the land which we are zooming from, and like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people whose land I am on now and I work and play on. This land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. To be really honest, I never had any aspirations of becoming a politician. When I came to Australia, I, not even in my wildest dreams, thought that I could ever be in the Senate of Australia. And I really didn't even think about being there because there was no one like me there, right? And as you said, Molina, there's still very few people. But although I didn't want to be a politician, politics was never far from my mind. Having grown up in Pakistan, like everyone there talks politics much more than they do in Australia, so the rickshawala, when you go to a beauty parlor, all the women in there, and dinner table conversations every night were about politics. And my mom tells me that, I had a real fire for fighting against injustice since I was very young. And she said I was a bit of a pain in her backside when I used to have continuous arguments with her about wanting to do the same things as my two older brothers were allowed to do, like flying kites from the rooftop or playing cricket in the streets, which girls weren't allowed to do. So I guess my politics started with the gender inequity issue. I kind of thought that they only existed in Pakistan, but since coming to Australia, you find out, that misogyny and sexism is a universal thing. And you have to fight and dismantle patriarchy if you want to deal with that. So, as migrants, and we know it's a very typical story, it takes quite a bit of time for you to settle in, find your feet, have a roof over your head, find jobs. And it took me and my husband about 10 years. And after 10 years, we were living in a small town in New South Wales on the north coast, which is Port Macquarie. And that's really when I got the time and the space to think about, community service or, getting kind of engaged in the political discussion here. And my values had always been closely aligned with the values of the Greens Party on the environment, of course, but also on social justice issues, like fighting against racism or for asylum seekers and for, other injustices happening around the world. So I joined the party as a political movement. I actually loved my job and my career, which is a civil and environmental engineer. So even then I joined the party, not thinking about becoming a politician. If there was a light bulb moment, Molina, it was once when I had put my hand up as a candidate in Sydney in a completely unwinnable seat because there was no one else who was we could find to do that. And we started door knocking as our strategy. And I think it was those hundreds of doors that we knocked on. And just the privilege of talking to people during an election campaign on what they wanted Australia and the world to be like. And, it was pretty exhilarating for me to think that I could take those voices and those ideas and those thoughts into Parliament and do something with them. So I think that was the point where I thought, no, I think I can do this. I can use my 20 years of experience in the real world and take that into Parliament and, go there with an open mind, with all that lived experience in two different continents, and hopefully try and change Australia for the better. And I guess the rest is history.
Thanks, Mehreen. Obviously, you've been doing a great job. Elizabeth.
Hello, and yeah, it's funny because I think that most people have very different journeys into politics, but I do share one commonality with Mehreen, and that is that when I migrated to Australia as a 7-year-old back in in the 80s, living in Western Sydney, there's no way that I would have even fathomed that I had a future in Australian politics, because at the time, the only thing that you know about politics is middle-aged white men sort of screaming at each other across a room. So there's no way that I would have even fathomed it. But I did pursue law as a career, and when I was working in private practice, I had the privilege of being very heavily involved with the Law Society and the Law Council of Australia, and held the role of chair of the ACT and then the Australian Young Lawyers Committees, and then vice president of the Law Society. And I really, really enjoyed being able to advocate for and represent my profession. And I was talking to someone one day, I remember, and I said, oh, I'd love to do this as a job. I'm doing it voluntarily, but I'd love to do it as a job because I think I'm good at it, but I really am passionate about advocating for and representing people. And someone goes, oh, you mean politics? When are you going to go into that? And I kind of just went, is that what it is? And I realized, of course, that being in the privileged position of being elected by members of your community, of your peers, to be their voice, to be their representative, is what politics is about. And so I put my hand up. I did have an unsuccessful run at politics, and Mehreen also talked about having put her hand up for a very, very unwinnable seat. I've had my own run at that as well. So I think one of the common things is, number one, we didn't think that it was for us, but number two, I think that we've all faced some adversity and challenges before we actually were able to be where we are today. So I'm very privileged to have been elected in 2016 and then to be elected leader in 2020 of my party in the ACT.
Obviously, the politics is benefiting from both of yours involvement. So it's great that you took that path. I just wanted to ask you, I mean, we talk about having diversity in politics, but what are the benefits that you think you bring to politics and others like you could potentially bring to politics as well? Mehreen, you can go first again.
Yeah, Molina, as you said earlier, I mean, Australia is perhaps one of maybe the most multicultural country in the world, or very close to it. But as you pointed out, our political representation is so lacking in that diversity. Even now, when everyone has been raving about, this is the most multicultural, diverse parliament we have seen. You say only 15 people, right? And if you do the numbers, we need at least 50 people like us if we want to have that, equal representation. So I guess diversity is about equality of representation. That's the first point. But I think probably even more important than that is, about decision making. Who makes decisions and how those decisions impact everyone who lives in this country. And that's the key. And, from what I feel, that unless people who are affected by political decisions are in that space, on that table of decision making, then they will be screwed over. And we have seen that many times over. And I can give you the example of our terrible asylum seeker policies, especially what happened during COVID. The only people who were left out of the financial support during COVID that the federal government handed out were international students and migrant workers, because there isn't enough representation of people like them in politics that look like them. So I think it is about actually making decisions and not leaving them up to, as Elizabeth, you said, old white privileged men, and now also mostly white privileged men and women. I think that is a real problem. That is a real problem. And I think it was really apt that you pointed that out. It's great that we have more women, and that's needed, but it depends on who those women and others are as well. And it's not just about gender either. We need more people with different lived experiences. We need more people who, disabled people and all ranges of diversity. And unless we do that, then certain parts of our community will always be left out of decisions, and decisions will be made that affect them negatively.
Absolutely, Mehreen. Elizabeth.
Politics is about representative democracy, and I've always said that our parliaments, no matter what level, so local, state, territory, or the federal level, it should reflect as much as possible the diversity and the broad representation that we see in our community, because it is about making sure that we are there and making decisions on behalf of and for our community, the community that we serve. And for too long, that diversity hasn't existed. And it's funny because it's about that decision, and I agree with Mehreen, it is about that decision-making table and the reason why it's so important. But if you have the diversity of views and experiences, and I'm not just talking about gender or culture, but in terms of life experiences and qualifications as well, it does make for better and more robust debates, which in turn makes for better policy. There's no doubt about it. And that's why it's so important to see more diverse voices in Parliament, because that is the ultimate decision-making table for our community.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And obviously, both of you have highlighted some of the benefits of having diversity in politics, but we don't really see that many people of diverse backgrounds in politics. So what do you think are the main reasons why we don't see that many people of diverse background? Is it, Mehreen had earlier mentioned that you first stood for elections in a non-winnable seat. That happens a lot of time with people of color. That is obviously one of the reasons, but I'm sure there's many others that you can highlight being part of the system yourself.
That is definitely, we saw in the last election what happened in Fowler. So we already have so many barriers, and we could do without further barriers being put up by our own parties, for instance, to stop us from, representing our communities. I went through this period in the federal parliament where bullying, harassment, sexual misconduct, sexual assault, all that was exposed in the federal parliament. And it was mainly women who were facing that. And we also found out that people of color and, First Nations, Torres Strait Island people with disability, it was much, much worse for them. So that is not going to instigate, any confidence in people like us that they should be in Parliament. So, that needs to change. And, I feel that there is some momentum for change happening in there. But also, I think, apart from that, the issues of, like women of color especially have faced a lot of racism, and that intersection of racism and sexism is really harsh and difficult to deal with. I remember Nova Perez, who was the first Indigenous woman in the Australian Parliament. She actually left after just one term in the Senate. And years later, she very clearly said that one of the big reasons she left was that barrage of racism that she faced every single day. And it happens inside Parliament and it happens from outside Parliament. So I think there's obviously political parties that need to change. There is the culture of Parliament that needs to change. But ultimately, our biggest job, I think, is to change society towards becoming anti-racist and inclusive. And I think a big part of the problem is some of the right-wing media, which are flag bearers of this. And also I guess in the chamber that I sit in, and we've had a saga just over the last unfolded over the last couple of weeks, where people can blatantly be racists and not be held accountable for.
Thanks, Mehreen. I will probably explore that a little bit more later, racism within the chambers. But Elizabeth, I'm keen to hear your views first.
Yeah, one of the things that I was reflecting on with the result of the last federal election, and yes, I agree that there was some cause for celebration, that we saw a lot more diversity in terms of the people that were elected. But what was really interesting was, and I think all parties do this, is that they put up the Asian candidate in the Asian area. And so we're still seen as being the vehicle for getting or capturing the Asian vote. So that tells us, each time it happens, that tells us that we're still not accepted in mainstream Australian society as just being a good enough candidate, but we're there to, try and get as much of the Asian vote as possible. And I think, when that kind of stuff continues to happen, it does, again, in that very subtle way, continue to tell us that, yeah, you're good enough to be the Asian part of it, but you're not really accepted into that mainstream society. And I think that's a problem that we need to work on. The other aspect is, and Mehreen touched on this as well, but there are a lot of stereotypes that come with being an Asian woman in a Western culture. And a lot of the times people will either, before I open my mouth, will expect that I'll have an accent, despite the fact that, as you can tell, I've got the most broad Aussie accent on earth. Or they'll make some assumptions about your personality. A lot of the times it's either you're a tiger mum or you're a meek Asian, sort of traditional woman. And those prejudices and stereotypes are really hard to get across because they're embedded in a lot of people's minds. So another example that I have is that I know that sometimes I'm not taken seriously because I am an Asian woman. Even stuff like, it seems like minor, but a lot of people think that I'm a lot younger. And, so I'm sort of, considered to be, well, you're the young person. And people forget I'm actually older than Dom Perrottet by a number of years, So people don't look at men and go, oh, yeah, you're too young. But they do look at women, and I think especially Asian women, and go, oh, yeah, well, a bit inexperienced and a bit young. So there are a lot of those things. And I think that's one of the, a couple of the reasons why we probably don't see as many Asian or non-Anglo women putting their hands up to go into politics.
Yes, Elizabeth, some of the non-benefits of looking younger. I get that often as well, being a lawyer and not taken seriously. But both of you touched on this, and we probably explored this already, but women are constantly under attack, and women of color face the double whammy, as I call it, the double glazed glass ceiling. And it is, both of you have mentioned that it is difficult being an Asian woman in politics. And I myself, as a woman of color, taking on leadership roles is considered a troublemaker. I have to work doubly hard to prove myself, and I'm overlooked for leadership positions. You both of you have similar experiences as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, it's like this quadruple whammy, frankly, of being a woman of color, a Muslim, and a migrant. I migrated here when I was 28 years old. And I think, Elizabeth, what you touched on is exactly what happens being a Muslim woman. People have this stereotype and this box that you put you in. And that box really is about an oppressed woman. Whose husband or whose brother or whose father basically tells her what to do, and she complies. So I guess for me, then, when people hear me, and I'm pretty loud and proud and unapologetic about who I am, and the policies I advocate for, it kind of comes as a shock to people. And then you become that angry black or brown woman suddenly. And so it's damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of scenario. I have also realized, I guess, over the years in public life, that, it doesn't matter what I say. The hate and abuse mostly that I get is about who I am, where I come from, what I look like. And so I've kind of figured out that for some of us in this country, our kind of Australianness is conditional. You know, it is conditional on us keeping our mouth shut. It is conditional on us kind of agreeing with those in power. It is conditional on us being forever grateful for being let into this wonderful country. And it's conditional on us on kind of giving up our heritage and just assimilating. And then it's all fine. There is that idea of a good migrant and a bad migrant, right? And a good migrant is you keep your head down, keep working. And all of us have been doing that already. But a bad migrant is anyone who takes part in political debate and wants to make this. I mean, my reason for being in politics is to make this country even better and the best place for everyone. But some people don't like hearing it from us. So I think there is a real problem. And the last thing I'll say is that, being a first in politics on various, in various areas, while it's a real privilege and kind of I guess, opening the door for others, it also is a huge responsibility. And I feel that, any step I feel that I will take wrong will be kind of a poor mark on others like me who want to follow. I mean, they'll say, look at her, we gave her this opportunity, look what she does. So it is a bit of a heavy load that you carry as well. And we shouldn't have to, we really shouldn't have to.
You're absolutely right. The burden that we have to bear being the first is hard. It really is. And I actually question that the role modeling concept as well, because that means that all of us need to behave in a certain way, to be the role models or be held to account to that level to be successful, which should not be the case. We should all, even if we're ordinary, we should be recognized, because there's a lot of Anglos who are pretty ordinary and doing amazingly well and are still considered role models. So that is definitely an issue. Elizabeth, did you want to add anything to that?
I was just going to add that it's funny how we talk about racism and sexism and that double, whammy, as you talked about. But I've also noticed over the last couple of years this additional phenomenon, which kind of is like it's multifaceted in terms of the racism. So I get the comments about, look, I really like you, Elizabeth, but I'm really concerned about the infiltration of the Chinese government in our politics. And I went, well, number one, I'm not Chinese, and horrendous. That's the first thing. You've just made an assumption about that. And then this reverse sort of racism that comes in that says, oh, okay, you're one of the good migrants. It's really, really fascinating that it starts to become a little bit of this twisted web. And I think it just reminds us that these types of challenges that we face, they're never a one-dimensional or a simple thing. There's a lot of complexity around it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's our Australianness is always questioned in whatever way. So that's one way that it is questioned as well. So let's move on a little bit towards law, because we've got a lot of lawyers who are listening in to us in today as well. So do you think the lack of diversity in politics has an impact on lawmaking? For example, something I worked on has been dowry abuse, and that is a concept that was not well understood by the legislators, the judiciary, and the police. And that is because none of these institutions are diverse. Though through the work of a not-for-profit that I'm on the board of, we finally got dowry introduced as a form of economic abuse in the family violence legislation in Victoria. But it took a long time, numerous petitions and a submission to the Royal Commission. Perhaps if we had legislators like yourself who are from diverse backgrounds, then this would be a fairly easy process that is understood. What are your views on that? Maybe Elizabeth, you can start. You're a lawyer as well, so.
Thanks, Molina. I think this is really, really complex. And the reason is because whilst it is important that we do get people with diverse backgrounds in the lawmaking, at the lawmaking table, if you like, which will take into consideration the diversity of cultures, of experiences, and of history, we also do need to find that balance between where it sits with Australian contemporary values as well. So the area that I'm talking about is, for example, female genital mutilation, those types of very, very, very complex issues. And so that is something that's exceedingly difficult, but is going to benefit greatly from having those diverse range of voices at that table who are contributing to the debate. You know, there's never going to be a one right answer. Otherwise, let's face it, Molina, as lawyers, we'd be out of jobs, right? If laws were able to be written and then put in concrete and then, you know, forever or more be not face any uncertainty, there would be no jobs for lawyers. So we know that it is an evolving thing, and for want of a better word, human-made law is always going to be changing because we change. So that's why it's even more important that we do see the diverse range of voices and experiences that are sitting around that table, especially when it comes to lawmakers, because it affects each and every one of us, and that's important.
Yeah, you're right, Elizabeth. Then Mehreen, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just add, I think Elizabeth is absolutely right. And I mean, there are laws that might particularly be affecting, you know, people like us or women. And obviously, you know, they need that lens. But every single law, frankly, affects people in this country. And if we are not there, then our perspective is totally missed out. And I gave the example of COVID earlier. I mean, very quickly during COVID, when COVID hit, we found out that the people who were suffering most were women and young people, for instance. And then we already know that in the category of women, it is those diverse women who suffer most. And, you know, when I raised this in the Senate in the first few weeks of how COVID was panning out on these groups of people, I was really mocked and laughed at in the Senate, but also by the right-wing media, because we were making laws at that point and we had to look at those, you know, kind of impacts clearly and to make sure that we didn't disproportionately affect those people even more when we made legislation for that particular period. And I know that 2 months after that, the United Nations had a huge report which said to us exactly what I had said in the Senate then, but there weren't enough people to kind of support that notion in there. So there wasn't much support, like I said earlier, provided to, you know, migrant workers and others who already, you know, suffer from wage theft, from, you know, underpayment and all those issues. And that just exacerbated hugely during that period. But that happens during all periods and all laws that are made. So it is absolutely vital that we are there at the table.
Yeah, and Elizabeth, you're the only lawyer, I mean, Sandra's not here, but the only lawyer on this panel. So I would be really keen to hear about your experiences of being a lawyer now in politics. Is that an advantage? Like both of you spoke about, you know, why it's important for people of diverse backgrounds to be there, but as a lawyer, you have that additional benefit as well. Does that add to the debate?
I think it does. Obviously, we want politics to be open to everyone from all walks of life. And I think in Australia, we broadly are, and we see people who come from different backgrounds. You know, and this is despite the fact that in recent times, people have criticised that a lot of them are from, you know, either a union or a staffer background. But generally speaking, it's different to some of the other countries around the world where politics is only for the elite class, if you like. So I think in Australia, we are fortunate in that regard. But having a law degree does, I think, help. If nothing else, you just become familiar with looking at legislation. You just know how to read it and you know how to go through it. But on saying that, when I first got into politics, Molina, I have to say that I had to very, very much take my lawyer hat off and put on the politician hat because I had to tell myself, no, don't read the legislation and look for a faults or look for the, you know, drafting issues. That's not what it's about. It's actually about what impact it has. And so I have learned to step a little bit away from being a pure lawyer about some of the legislation that I go through, mostly because on a practical level, I just don't have time to read through every single line. It just is not realistic. But I do think that there is some advantage in the way law and the practice of law makes you think and analyse legislation, the way it is applied, and also being a litigator, the way that it actually, when things get unstuck. So I think there is some advantage for lawyers. So if there are any lawyers who are listening in now and have aspirations for politics, I would say it is definitely something that you can see as an advantage.
Yeah, there are some, because we had a summit dinner last night in Victoria, and there was someone who specifically asked that, and they were really keen to hear from all of you about opportunities. We'll talk about that as well in a minute. But Mehreen, I know you're very vocal about a number of issues in the parliament, including racism. Do you think that being a woman facing a triple whammy, these issues get lost because of your background, or are deliberately made a topic of controversy? You know, the recent attack on you by Pauline Hanson, it just goes to show that we are subjected to by white privileged people, including women, on a constant basis.
Mm-hmm. You know, I have reflected on that a lot, Molina. And, you know, the conclusion I have come to is that in our country here, we do have a real problem with actually acknowledging racism. And that really stems from the way this country was violently colonized, and the treatment of First Nations people to this day, where they are dying in custody, they're over incarcerated, they have such disadvantage in every kind of sphere of life. And, you know, I've had conversations with people living in other countries like the US or the UK, and over there, the difference I see is that there has been an acceptance that yes, there is systemic discrimination and racism that is built within institutions, and that needs to be tackled. Here, unfortunately, no acknowledgement of that. So people who raise issues of racism, and that's happened to me and others, a few others, you know, in Parliament, they are the ones who are called out for dividing the community by calling out racism. So we're the ones who are pulled up. I mean, that's like gaslighting 101, right? And you know, the race card, the sex card, that's always thrown back at you. But for me, like, the only way to even start tackling racism, you know, whether it's on a personal level, and really what we want to do is more deeply at a systemic level, that's where we want to get at. The first point to do that is to actually call it out. Unless we call it out, and you saw what happened, or people may or may not have seen what happened when I did call it out. Basically, the Liberal and the Labour Party joined together to take, you know, from my censure motion, take out exactly what I was doing and do a broad, you know, kind of motion about condemning racism, which is still good. But unless the perpetrators are held to account, I think it'll be very, very hard. And it's a real struggle in Australia. But I do say, on the hopeful side, that there are more and more voices which are becoming louder on this, because it has been, for many decades, really impacting on people. And I think it is also a legacy of the White Australia policy, which is still like the superiority, you know, of people who colonized this country. That's still an element. But the only way to get rid of it is to start talking about it and being louder about it.
Yeah, and I think the fact that we don't have a Bill of Rights enshrined in a constitution or even separately is such a huge issue.
Yeah.
And also our laws in relation to discrimination are not strong enough. And the anti-discrimination bodies don't have enough power. So we do have a lot that we have to still,
Absolutely.
you know,
Absolutely.
get done for this.
Absolutely.
This
and yeah, just to add one more thing to that, I am actually in a parliamentary committee at the moment, which is developing a code of conduct for parliamentarians. Like, it's hard to believe that in 2022, you know, the leaders of this country don't have a code of conduct that they have to adhere to. So I'm trying my best to make sure that that does include issues of discrimination, like racism and disability discrimination, and, you know, LGBTQI discrimination, to make sure that it's crystal clear to everyone that this sort of behavior is unacceptable, and then they can actually be held accountable to that code of conduct.
Yeah, absolutely, Mehreen. We might, because we're sort of heading towards the end, we still have a bit of time, but I wanted to ask both of you on what can be done then to see more people of Asian backgrounds in politics and potentially law as well. If you have any suggestions for law, maybe Elizabeth has, but I would like to hear from both of you on that.
Elizabeth, you go first.
Thanks. I think, you know, the good start is to have people who look like us, you know, the people who look different from the norm, to be there. And hopefully the next generation will never, ever feel what Mehreen and I felt when we first moved to Australia, where politics was not even something that we would fathom or even consider. It just didn't come onto the radar. I would hope that the next generation just don't even think about it in that way, and they're actually able to make a decision that's realistic about whether or not they wish to go into politics. We always talk about wanting to do politics different, and every single person, I have no doubt that every person who goes into politics wants to make their mark and do things differently. But it is also about the system that we're in. It is an adversarial system, and that's the system that we find ourselves in. And you do end up being, it's a sort of.
Elizabeth's hung now. Mehreen, maybe you can.
Yeah, sure.
You can take over. Hopefully, she can.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, the advantage of some of us now being in parliaments is that hopefully, we can open that door that was shut to us a little bit more ajar for others who can come and then, basically smash that door down. And one day we will reach a place where we don't have to struggle and fight our way through to, to places and positions and roles where we should have a right to be in any way. So I guess that's one thing. The political parties obviously have to change the way they pre-select and who they pre-select in winnable seats. That absolutely has to change. And I think after the Jenkins review of the culture of parliamentary workplaces, there has been a very strong recommendation for political parties to do that and to report back on how diversity is changing in their parties. So I think that is a really, really good sign.
Elizabeth, now you're back. Did you want to get back?
Sorry, yeah, I don't know what happened there, but they did kick me out. The only other thing that I would add also is the fact that, we sort of referred to this, both Mehreen and I, about the difficulty of being the first, but the first being done, there's not many people who report on who's the second or the third or the fourth, right? So I'm hoping that now that becomes a bit of the norm. So when I first became, the leader of a major party, and it was like, oh, it's the first time for someone from an Anglo-Saxon background. But hopefully the second or the third or the fourth, it's not news, because it's the norm now. And I think the more we start to see that, and the more the media and the more the community starts to see that, the more normalized it is that we have these diverse faces, that we have these diverse voices in our parliaments.
Yeah, I mean, for law, I think we've been talking about, we also talk about quotas and targets, and not sure how that will work in politics so much, but what are your views on targets and quotas? Do they work?
I mean, I think they absolutely do work. And from the low base that we are in Australia, something like that needs to happen to do that. I mean, I must say, I'm very proud to be in a party that has, a number of, First Nations women, and I'm there, and in New South Wales, there's a woman of color as well. And we do have affirmative action in our party, in terms of gender. We still don't have, though, in terms of diversity. So I think absolutely it helps, but there's a huge resistance, I know, in political parties or in, in generally in Western kind of countries for quotas. It's all merit-based, as if all the other white Anglo people are there on merit. And I think one other thing, Molina, if I could say needs to change as well, is that there is one majority typical pathway into politics in this country, which is being a student, kind of a political representative in your university, then becoming a staff member for a politician, and then becoming a politician. And it's very hard for anyone else to get a look in if you don't come through that pathway. So I think that's what political parties can do as well, kind of look outside and support people who are, not typically coming through that pathway.
Thanks, Mehreen. I think I can still see Elizabeth, but she messaged me saying that she's been kicked out of her computer. So I'm not sure if she's there. Elizabeth, are you there? She's saying her computer's gone blank. She just messaged me. Our panel's having real tech issues today. I'm not sure why. We're probably going to wind up soon anyways. So perhaps just because we've got you there, we'll just ask, I'll ask you this question. Do you have any advice for any of our attendees wanting to actively participate in the political system? Because I'm sure many of them would have felt very inspired after hearing from you. And related to that is a question that was sent across. Someone from the audience is asking, I should like to hear about the opportunities and or pipeline for the leadership positions in politics.
Opportunities and, sorry, what was that?
Pipeline for leadership positions in politics.
Okay.
Yeah. Or in opportunities
How
that are
much
there.
time do you have?
Opportunities there are. Maybe there's opportunities you can talk about, and that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I guess my advice is do it, people. You know, I when I was at university doing my PhD with 2 little kids, I kind of was at one point, I was like, this cannot happen. I just cannot do anymore. I'm going to give up. And someone recommended for me to go and see a counselor at university. And that counselor told me one piece of advice that I remember from her, which is still stuck in my head and my heart, is she said, Mehreen, feel the fear, but do it anyway. Because you know when you are fearful of something, it's often something really worth doing. It's hard, but you know that the reward that you get will also be big. So, and I often say to women of color that no one is really going to roll out a red carpet for us. We really have to roll up our sleeves and get to work. We've got to and we have the capacity and the skills and the intellect and the intelligence to do it. So don't let anyone tell you that you are not capable of doing it. And I guess from my perspective, I feel it is my role to support as many women of color and we like young women of color who want to pursue the same kind of journey that I did and hopefully make that journey so much easier for them. I guess the leadership issue is a whole other issue, because even when we're seeing more and more women coming into politics, there are very few of them actually in leadership positions. And, kind of, as Elizabeth was saying, she was the first, Asian leader of a major political party. For me, I'm the first ever deputy leader. First ever Muslim woman to be a deputy leader of a party. So again, things are shifting. But yeah, I mean, I also will say it's not easy. It is not easy. So let's not fool ourselves, but we are here to support others. And I'm very happy for anyone, who's joined us today to give us a call. And I'm very happy to have a chat to them as well on a one-on-one basis. I think it is my role to do that.
Thanks, Mehreen. And that is the sign of true leadership. We all need to anyways put our hands up. Like I always say, take an opportunity if it comes to you. Even if they say you're getting it because you're ticking a box, that's fine. You'll go and prove yourself, because we do have that capability. And that meritocracy argument, I just don't buy that, because if it was true, there'd be more of us actually there. We do have merit. So this has been a great conversation. We've missed Cassandra, of course, because of technical issues, and now we've lost Elizabeth as well. But that's all right. We sometimes have to deal with these tech issues, but it has been still been a great conversation, and thank you so much for your insights and time. I wish our parliament was as amicable and all the parties agreed on as we were doing today. We would have maybe we need more women of diverse backgrounds there for things to get done.
Absolutely.
So, thank you so much again for your time and your insights, and hopefully we'll meet again in the future. And when we do, we will be in a situation where we see more diversity in the parliament and in law. Thank you so much, Mehreen, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real privilege. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.